Thank you. It's very kind. So I apologize for the world's dimmest PowerPoint screen behind me, but don't worry, you don't actually need to be able to read that to get the hang of what I'm saying. So I've been asked to speak about whether belief in God is compatible with modern science. And I guess I've been living this question for the last, 30 years or so. I became a Christian at the age of 18, directly before coming up to Cambridge to read natural sciences. So pretty much within my first week of term in Cambridge, I was already having to work out how to reconcile my newfound Christian faith with my emerging understanding of modern physics. So 25, 30 years on, this is pretty much where I've got in my thinking on this. So I guess I want to turn it around and say, well, why wouldn't they be compatible? And I guess if we went out into the street and asked people why they thought, if you're a scientist, Christianity has nothing to offer you, I think there'd probably be three things that they would pick on. They would probably claim that there were very few practicing scientists who believe in God. A lot of people who've never looked into this just assume that most scientists are atheists. They might say there's something to do with origins, evolution and Big Bang contradict the Bible. We seem to have a pretty good view of evolution and Big Bang from science, therefore the Bible must be wrong. And I guess maybe the more philosophically minded might have some concerns about evidence and proof and things like that. So I just want to go through those three very briefly and just give you my take on actually why I think these three things aren't a problem. I think there are really good answers to all of these three, and how if you remove these objections, you find that actually simultaneously believing in God and pursuing modern science is actually a really great thing to do. So let's look at this idea that very few practicing scientists believe in God. Without overstating the case, it's just not true. It never has been true. If you look at the origins of modern science, so at least within the physical sciences, which is the area I know better, these three characters probably are the founding fathers. So we've got James Clerk Maxwell, who was the founding father of electromagnetism. We've got Michael Faraday, who was the father of electricity. And we've got Robert Boyle, who was absolutely the father of all of chemistry. And the thing that's notable about these three chaps, apart from the size of their hair and moustaches and beards and the like, is the fact that they were all people of profound Christian faith. Robert Boyle was actually one of the wealthiest men in all of Britain at the time. And when he died, he left a considerable fortune in legacy to overseas Christian mission. That was what he wanted to do with his money. Michael Faraday, those of you who've done a bit of physics, you'll know about the threefold rule of current, motion, and field. That comes from Faraday. And if you look at the biographies, the reason he got to that threefold rule was because, as a Christian, he believed that God is Trinity, and he therefore believed that that threefold symmetry of God ought to be reflected in all of the major laws of nature. I mean, I wouldn't say that was a good way to do science today, but historically it was his starting point, and therefore he looked explicitly for threefold patterns and indeed found them. And if we look at Maxwell, those of you who've been to the Cavendish will know the answer to this question, but a little quick quiz. What's written above the door of the Cavendish Laboratory, the physics department here in Cambridge? Maybe you think it's physics is fun. Maybe you think abandon hope, all you who dare to enter. Or, as is actually the case, the works of the Lord are great, sought out of all of them that have pleasure therein. You may have walked into that 100 times and never noticed it. Now, that's not to say that everybody who works in the Cavendish is a Christian. It's not even to say that everybody there agrees with that statement. What it is to say is that James Clerk Maxwell, who was the first Cavendish professor, so profoundly believed that the things that he was doing in his new laboratory was studying the works of the Lord, that he insisted on having it written above the door. And when the laboratory moved from central Cambridge out to the west side in the early 70s, people realized that this was so much a part of Maxwell's makeup that the sign was transported and recreated above the door. It's just a reminder of how, at the very heart of physics, Maxwell somehow managed to hold these two things together. Now, scientists like statistics, so if you want a few statistics, here they are. So there have been lots of surveys that look at what scientists believe. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I've picked out what are probably seen as the three most influential, and they date all the way from modern times right back to 1916. And surprisingly, I should say these were taken in America, largely because America has both got a lot of religious faith, and it's got an awful lot of science. And so that's a great test bed in which to test compatibility between the two. And the thing that's really quite remarkable about those is that the numbers have stayed fairly constant throughout 100 years, that depending on how tightly you define belief in God, somewhere between 30 and 50% of practicing scientists would say that they could ascribe to that. Now, there's lots of things we could talk about with these. We should compare them to the background statistics. We should compare them to different grades within science. All of those things we can do, and I don't want to do it now. All I want to say is that I think I agree with Stephen Jay Gould. So Stephen Jay Gould is one of the great paleontologists, although he's not a Christian, and he's not particularly friendly towards Christians. But his take on this is that either half of his colleagues are enormously stupid, or else the science of Darwinism is fully compatible with conventional religious beliefs and equally compatible with atheism. So Gould is saying if he just looks around the scientists that he knows, he sees so many of them with religious views on both sides that it seems very unlikely that science is driving either of them, either towards faith or towards atheism. So that's all I've got time to say about scientists believing. Let's think a little bit now about evolution and Big Bang and whether they contradict the Bible. So evolution and Big Bang, these are huge subjects, and I could talk for the rest of the day on this. You'll be glad to know I'm not going to. All I'm going to do, though, is just draw out 2 or 3 things that I think are interesting and are worth considering. So the first is to do with Big Bang and its origins as a bit of science. So the scientist most associated with Big Bang is usually Edwin Hubble, the same Hubble as of the telescope. And he noticed that the further away a star was, if you measured its color, the redder it appeared to be, the so-called redshift. And that means the star is moving more quickly away from you. So essentially, the further out it is, the faster it's moving away. There are 2 possible explanations for that. Either the Earth is at the very center of the universe, which is probably unlikely, or it means the entire universe is expanding. And that's the scientific evidence that we've got for Big Bang. What's really surprising, though, is that Hubble himself never coined that term, Big Bang. And actually, Hubble wasn't the first to observe the redshift. The person who really got there first was another scientist called George Lemaitre. He coined the term Big Bang, and he made the first observation of the redshift. And if you can see that picture, you might notice there's something slightly odd about his neck, and he's wearing a clerical dog collar, and that's because he was a Catholic priest. So the first thing we note about Big Bang is actually the science was pioneered by a Christian, and that should maybe give us pause to thought. The other thing that I want to talk about briefly with regard to Big Bang and its compatibility with Bible views is that of literary genre. So those of you who are on the art side, this is your moment, this is your thing. I'm sure you know this more than I do. So here are 3 books. I'm sure you've read them all. Delia's cookery book, Animal Farm, and this week's Applied Physics Letters. And you don't need a PhD in literary criticism to know that these are different genres of literature. You've got the genre of recipe, you've got the genre of satire, and you've got the genre of scientific journal. And I think we know, just by comparing these different books, that the questions that we ask and the expectations that we bring to a piece of literature really depends critically on the genre. So if I open an applied physics letter and I don't see any electron micrographs, I'm really disappointed, because within the genre of scientific journal, an electron micrograph is really a good thing and an important thing to have. To be honest, the fact that Delia doesn't have any electron micrographs doesn't concern me in the least. It's not part of the genre of recipe to put electron micrographs. Maybe more subtly, if I started to read Animal Farm, and if a few pages in, I said, well, hang on, this is all about talking pigs. My scientific study has told me that pigs don't speak. Therefore, Animal Farm is wrong, and it has no value to bring to me, and I'm not going to read it. That would be a ridiculous thing to say. It would be an ignorant thing to say. It would show I didn't know the first thing about how to read a text. It's a point of Christian faith that the Bible is a collection of books and that it's come to us as different human genre. It's not dictated word by God, even though I and many here would be very happy to say it is the Word of God. We recognize that there are different styles, different genres. There's poetry, there's history, there's investigative journalism, and that recognizing that genre is really the first place you start in learning how to interpret a given book of the Bible. All I would say about Big Bang and evolution is that most of the apparent conflict between the scientific view and the Christian view of these things comes from failing to recognize the genre of Genesis. It's very easy to instinctively slip into the mindset that Genesis should be written in the genre of scientific journal, which it most certainly isn't, and that we therefore bring the wrong questions to it and hence get the wrong answers. There's one other thing I'd like to say, though, and that's about what I'd call the limited scope of the Bible. We assume that when we open a book like the Bible, its agenda is going to be the same as our agenda. And maybe our agenda, the top question is, where did the universe come from? Similar questions to what George Lemaitre was dealing with. And actually, that's not the Bible's top priority. The Bible is much more interested in the very focused question of who is God, how does he relate to us, where do we stand with respect to him, what does he require of us? So I think if we go right back to the days of Galileo, who was somebody who, as you will know, had a bit of trouble with this whole subject, there's a great exchange of correspondence between Caesar Baronius and Galileo. And he said, the Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. And that really, for me, captures it. And that once we get that into our heads, once we stop looking for detailed scientific genre cosmological arguments in the Bible, we suddenly find it's got wonderful things to say about the origins of the universe and, more importantly, the nature of God. So, thirdly, let's just talk a little bit about evidence and proof. And as I say, this is more for the philosophically minded. So, as we might expect, Richard Dawkins is very good at coining a pithy phrase to try to present the problem. And so Dawkins puts it like this: faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. And so you can see the problem. If you're a scientist, your whole training, your whole instinct, your whole orientation is towards finding evidence for things and only believing things that you can prove. So how could you possibly be a Christian, given that to be a Christian means to throw all that away and to basically believe whatever you like? If words aren't your thing, if you're more a picture sort of guy, then maybe this is what you think of the relationship. You probably can't see that. The relationship between faith and thinking, that the idea of faith in your brain is this aggressive monster eating away bit by bit at the thinking part until it's consumed everything. And I think really the problem here is Richard Dawkins misunderstands, surprisingly, the nature of science and definitely misunderstands the nature of at least Christian faith. So let me just unpack that a little bit further. So we have this caricature of modern science that it's a very linear process and that we observe something and then we prove something and that's it locked down and then we move forward to the next step. And on we go, inductively, proving and advancing. And actually, those of us who've worked in real research know that that's not the way it is at all. It's far less linear, and there's far more uncertainty in modern science than maybe the general public thinks. Science is about creating narratives, creating paradigms, which best fit the limited data set available. And sometimes we will develop a paradigm, we'll develop a narrative to be quite an advanced level, and then within a relatively short space of time, maybe just 10 years, we'll throw it out completely and say, well, actually, that wasn't such a helpful way of thinking about things anymore. Things that, to a previous generation, were completely nailed down, all of a sudden disappear and stop being the way we think about things. I've been a scientist in magnetism and electrons for 25, 30 years now, and yet I've never really seen an electron. And that's because the scale on which I need to operate is so far from what I can observe directly that I can't see or measure the things that I really want to. All of the things that I think I know about the physics of magnetism and the physics of electrons, I've inferred by indirect observation, by putting together different pieces of evidence and making the best fit to them. That's what real science is like. And actually, I would argue that faith, at least Christian faith, is not so very different to that. We work in an environment of incomplete knowledge. I wish I could see God more clearly. I wish I could show God to you more clearly. I can't. But that doesn't mean to say we've got nothing to go on. I think Christian faith is about making the most rational and reasonable response to the limited information that's available. And in that respect, it's not actually that different to the methodology that we use in everyday science. Let me just show you a couple of little bits of the Bible which would emphasize this. So, Dr. Luke, a physician writing to Theophilus, said, "I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, so it seemed good also to write an orderly account, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." Now, this is, excuse me, this is really interesting. I'm a fellow of the Royal Society, and the motto of the Royal Society is nullius in verba, which is Latin for basically don't take anybody's word for it. And this marks a major philosophical shift in the early days of science, which really got the whole thing going. The secret sauce in science is that if I tell you something, you shouldn't believe me, but rather you should try to decide at what point the things that I'm telling you make contact with an external reality which you can go and do an experiment to go and contact, to go and touch. And this is in stark opposition to the way scientists used to think. Scientists used to think that by huddling together and thinking really hard, in complete isolation from any physical experiment, we could derive truth about the world that we live in. I think what Luke is saying here is basically the theological equivalent of that. Christian faith absolutely refuses to believe that we can think our way to God. The value of the knowledge that we have in God by putting our heads together is virtually zero, Christians say. The only way we can possibly know about God is if there is some contact between us and our worldview and his external reality. And remarkably, the Christian claim is that that contact has been made. There has been first contact, and it's in the historical person of Jesus. And that he is the experiment, if you like. He's the empirical evidence and is the reason that we believe what we believe about God. St. Paul went so far as to actually introduce an element of falsifiability into this. So those of you with a philosophical background will know that falsifiability is a big deal in epistemology and in knowing what we know. Essentially, as a scientist, if I create a hypothesis for which I could never do the experiment to test it, then I don't really have a right to believe it. There must be the theoretical possibility of proving my idea is wrong before I'm allowed to believe that idea. That's a key part of modern science. St. Paul, switching to theology now, says to a young Christian church, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. So he's saying, this historical person of Jesus, if the verifiable, observable fact that he was murdered and then came back to life again, if you can show that didn't happen, stop being a Christian. If this hasn't happened, if this historical event didn't take place, we're all wasting our time because we're not in the realm of finding real truth, we're in the realm of make-believe. And that's a really key part of Christian belief. And so I would encourage you, if you're interested in these things, if you haven't looked before, to be a scientist, to evaluate the historical person of Jesus and decide where the evidence points. Decide whether it's feasible, whether it's reasonable that he is the empirical observation of God, the touching of God with our reality, or whether he's just making it all up. And that's a decision that we can all actually investigate in the same way that Luke investigated on behalf of Theophilus. There's one other thing I'd want to say about truth, and that's about the limited scope of the scientific method. So just as we got into trouble by failing to spot the limited agenda, the limited mission of the Bible, equally we get into trouble if we fail to spot the limited scope of science. Let's think of some big things in life. Buying a house, it's a huge deal. Watching Shakespeare, really moving. Falling in love, I'm sure you're thinking about this. Raising children. Answering big questions. What's the meaning of life? Why am I here? How am I going to live the rest of my life? I would argue that although these are the things that really, at 4 o'clock in the morning particularly, preoccupy us above all else, nevertheless, science has relatively little to offer. Having bought a house recently, I sunk every penny that I had into it. It was a huge deal. I needed to be absolutely sure, more sure actually than I'd been in virtually anything else in my life, that having signed the contract and handed over the cash to a stranger, I really then did own it. In other words, that I had good title to the property. How did I find out? I didn't ask a scientist. I asked a lawyer. I recognized that as well as scientific truth, there's legal truth, there's truth in literature, life is bigger than a test tube. If we really want to know all the important things in life, we have to look beyond the scientific method, because that only really helps us when it comes to the physical mechanisms of how the universe works. And to be honest, we don't spend that much time worrying about those. There's one person who disagrees with this. That's what thinking the scientific method is the answer to all of your queries looks like. Dr. Sheldon Cooper, Esquire. And it doesn't go well. Okay, just in the final couple of seconds, whenever we're dealing with a big scientific problem, it's always good to identify the confounding factors, to say, what are the ways in which I can get this wrong? So if I know them in advance, I'm less likely to make a mistake. And I think there are two main confounding factors. So there's what we call science versus scientism. So science is the careful and international and corporate study of the physical universe. Scientism is the sociological religion constructed around science. It has its high priests, it has its sacred texts, and it has its fanatical followers. I would say that there's no fundamental contradiction between Christian faith and science, but there's a huge contradiction between Christian faith and scientism. The other confounding factor, or gotcha, if you like, is neo-Darwinism as a shorthand for atheism. So that picture there, there's a guy who parks his car near mine, and he's got that little sticker on his bumper. And for those of you who don't recognize it, it's basically a Christian fish with the word Darwin inserted in it and a couple of little legs. And I went to the website that sells them, and the caption on the website is, "For those who prefer the Galapagos to the Garden of Eden." And you see what's being done here. Darwinism is being put up as an alternative to Christianity. It's either or. You can either have the Christian fish or you can have the Galapagos. And actually, the reason I'm called it neo-Darwinism is that Darwin himself would have had no truck with this whatsoever. In Darwin's correspondence, writing to John Fordyce, Darwin says, "It seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist." Darwin wouldn't have had any time for the idea that it's one or the other. As far as he was concerned, these were two parallel descriptions of the world, and that it was up to each of us to work out where we stood with respect to God. So, in the final minute, how do I piece it all together? What does life look like through my eyes? Well, I would describe myself as an evolutionary creationist. So I'm a creationist in the sense that I believe God created the universe and sustains it every moment, and that he uses the mechanisms of Big Bang and evolution to do that. So the physics that I study in my lab, like Maxwell, is actually watching God's activity. And I would also say I'm a Bible-believing Christian. I believe that the Bible is God's inerrant word, and that it contains everything that I really need to know about the important things in life and death. And I would say it contains virtually no science. Although science is great, and it's a wonderful way to spend a lifetime, I don't think it ranks up there amongst the really important things in life and death. For that, we need to look more broadly. And personally speaking, I've found remarkable answers in the person of Jesus as described in the Bible. So here's just a quick recap. So lots of scientists believe in God, lots don't. There's only really an incompatibility between biblical and scientific views of origins, in other words, Big Bang, evolution, Genesis, if we do two things. If we forget to think about the genre of the biblical accounts, and we just assume they're written in the genre of scientific journal, and if we forget that the Bible is more concerned about getting us to heaven than it is about teaching us how the heavens go. Being a Christian doesn't mean we stop thinking, quite the reverse. And actually, the historical person of Jesus is the empirical and potentially falsifiable evidence on which Christian belief is based. If you really want something to hang on to and say, why is it that Christians believe what they believe, the historical person of Jesus is the place to start. And if you want to think about this, watch out for the gotchas of scientism and neo-Darwinism. It's really easy to confuse your thinking with those. If this has caught your attention and you'd like to read more, let me recommend two fantastic books. So Dennis Alexander, who is a scientist here in Cambridge, is, as far as I'm concerned, amazing in this subject and has written some wonderful things, particularly his book, Evolution or Creation, Do We Have to Choose? And the American Tim Keller, The Reason for God, has got some really interesting things. If you're more of an online sort of person, then the Faraday Institute here in Cambridge, which is essentially the science and Christianity think tank, they've got a great website with lots of resources, and on the US side, the Biologos Forum has got similar things. Thanks.
Great. So now we'll have just a quick minute to text in any last questions you might have, and we'll be taking some questions in a minute or so. Thank you. Can I take the laptop off? Is that all right?
There are
Yeah.
too many people in this
Great.
world trying to shout their names. Well, how am I supposed to know where to run? I don't know who's to blame. And I give people something along the way. Is it okay to be afraid of love if you don't understand it?
So I'll ask
And
the
the
question,
nights are so
anyone wants to come back on your
long without
answer,
you.
or if not, we'll
And the
take another
days
question from
speed
the floor.
up, my God, I'll never let go of you
Great.
now.
Oh,
'Cause
and
some things are not worth changing. My heart swells to the size of an orchid. It takes
great. Sorry to cut your conversation short. We're running a bit behind, so we'll just go straight into questions now. Okay, I'll start with a question that's been texted in. The Bible considers itself a historical record. It records instances of God performing miracles which defy science, of Jesus doing so, and of his followers after him doing so. How then do we explain the dearth of any recorded similarly science-defying occurrences now, which we could or should possibly expect to continue, given the cyclical nature of history and consistent nature of God?
I'm not sure we do. I think there are many Christians who would claim to have experienced miraculous things. Some of those claims will be bogus, and some of them will be true. But I don't think we all, I mean, there are different views between Christians amongst this, but I don't think we would all say that miracles have ceased completely. To broaden that out slightly, I think I would say that if we believe that what we call science and the laws of science are really just watching God at work, then the law element means it's really just watching what God tends to do on average. God works by order. But if actually it's all one continuum, if God is free to do whatever he likes, then there's no fundamental problem with him deviating from the norm when the time is right. I would also expect there to be an abundance of miracles surrounding somebody like Jesus. If, as we claim, Jesus is God breaking into the world, then it's not surprising that the natural order should respond in some sort of dramatic way, which I think is exactly what we see in the accounts by people like Luke and Mark, who are at pains to point out how everything from the wind and the waves suddenly seem to behave differently in the presence of Jesus.
Would anyone like to come back on that question, or any other question from the floor? Yeah, down here. If you could wait for the roving mic to record. Thank you.
Hi. I could see a sort of analogy between the way you described electrons as maybe be like you can never be absolutely sure there are really electrons, and all you have is really data that is well explained by the assumption of electrons, being kind of analogous with needing that extra little leap of faith to believe in God based on all the evidence, because you always need to maintain a kind of modicum of doubt. And if you're a scientific realist and you tend to assume that the objects described by science are really there and not just a good model, I could understand why it's an equivalent leap of faith to believe in electrons and to believe in God. But if you're not a scientific realist and you think that electrons are just a model and you have to, no matter how much you might want to, you have to maintain them as kind of with some doubt. Is it consistent to be a Christian? And I mean, if you maybe don't think about electrons, but say that Newtonian gravity, for example, was really successful, but then failed where general relativity took over, you always kind of, in my mind, you always have to maintain some doubt. So is it possible for me to be a faithful Christian and make that leap without being kind of a hypocrite?
Gosh, that's going to take more than 20 seconds. I think it is a Christian position that doubt is a very difficult thing for Christians. I think we would all say that we do not see God as clearly as we could or indeed will. In one of Paul's letters, he described it as seeing through a mirror dimly, seeing through a bad mirror, effectively. So we recognize that we don't have full vision. I think the point I was trying to make was that in science, that's often the case. We don't have full vision. And I don't think it matters what philosophical position you take as to whether not having a full position leads to doubt or leads to having to just hold on to the construct. Nevertheless, in science, we can never measure everything that we want to measure. We can only really see measure proxies. I think that's as far as I want to go in drawing the analogy, that in science, we don't let the lack of full knowledge stop us from saying, well, we at least know something. And I think it's the same in Christian faith. We don't have to wait for full revelation, if you like, to see God eyeball to eyeball before we're prepared to say, there is enough here to get going with.
Any more questions from the floor? Yeah.
Hi, you touched briefly on the historical person of Jesus. What empirical evidence is there for him rising from the dead?
Observation, primarily. So, I think there are a number of things, but the key ones in my mind are the 500 people who witnessed it and for whom it would have been very convenient to say they hadn't seen it. Remember, there was a huge political fight going on at the time. The ruling Romans would have been very pleased with anybody who could have deflated the whole Jesus myth at the time by saying, actually, no, this didn't happen. But there were huge numbers of eyewitnesses who were unable to change their story. But I think, to my mind, the thing that really turns it round is the change of behavior of his immediate followers. There was just an explosion happened historically at that point in time. People who'd given up when he was murdered and had gone back to their day jobs, all of a sudden just exploded out of Palestine and within a matter of years around the whole world. Something happened that turned them round. And the most reasonable explanation I can give is that the things that they and others were claiming, i.e. that they saw him again and talked with him and touched him, actually did take place. If they didn't happen, I'm really struggling to understand why we're talking about this today and why this didn't all die out 2,000 years ago as a forgotten myth.
I think we have time for one last question. Yeah, on the same table.
Thank you. I really like your example of Animal Farm, and you were talking about genres, and I study literature, and I've noticed that in the past the genres are not as clearly distinguished from each other as they are today, and the Animal Farm is read and people enjoy it because it claims to be an imaginative and creative writing rather than historical text. So my question is, to what extent do you think that the Bible should be understood as imaginative or creative text?
Sure. Thank you. That's a really important question. So there is a danger in what I'm saying here, and I know the Christians are on the edge of their seats here, ready to attack me if I get this wrong, that once you start to talk about genres, people feel that this is the thin end of a wedge argument, and that it's giving us license to basically adapt the text to say whatever we feel like. And let me be really clear, I'm absolutely not saying that. I think what I'm saying, though, is that part of reading the Bible responsibly is taking into account the genre in which a given text is written. So, for example, when I come to something like Luke's Gospel, which I quoted there, that is claiming up front to be investigative journalism. It's claiming to be a carefully validated and orderly account. I think I therefore have to take it at face value. And so when it talks about things that I know are impossible, people rising from the dead, people with disabilities suddenly losing those disabilities, all of those sorts of things, I've got to take it as it means, and I'm not allowed to say, well, he's just being poetical about it. When it comes to things like the Book of Revelation, for example, that's written in a genre that we don't even have today. It's a genre called apocalypse, and the nearest thing we've got is science fiction. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not true, but it just means that when I read about lamps and animals with multiple wings and heads, I've got to say, well, actually, this is code language within that genre that has to be interpreted correctly. What's the genre of Genesis? That's the tough question. It's not history in the sense that we know the genre of history, because, at least the early chapters, because there was no observer there. So it can't be a historical recollection in that sense. That doesn't mean to say, though, that I'm allowed to do whatever I want with it and just make up my own feelings. Quite the reverse, actually. But I do have to be faithful to what the original author intended me to understand by the style in which it was written.